From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 107. We've got an integral part of the CSP Massachusetts staff on today's show. He's a guy I really enjoy working with. I've learned a ton from collaborating with him on athletes, but also just watching him work. Brings some unique ideas to the table and always has a collection of innovative exercise that he'll utilize to get the most out of his pitchers. What I think is really important here too is that he draws on a wealth of experience from 12-year-olds all the way up to big leaguers. So there's something in here, for players, for parents, for coaches, you name it. I think there's something that we can all take away from this. So I think we're in for a really good show. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. 1 scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey. Today's guest serves as the pitching coordinator at Cressey Sports Performance, Massachusetts. A former athlete of CSP, he was both a shortstop and a pitcher at Wheeling Jesuit University and went on to pitch professionally for 6 years in the independent minor leagues. Prior to completing his internship and joining us at the CSP Massachusetts location, he served as a strength and conditioning and pitching coach at a private facility in Ohio. He also coached 3 years of baseball at the collegiate level. Please welcome to the show, Jordan Kraus. Welcome to the show, Jordan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's kind of an awkward welcome because we work together so much, but I am in Florida and you are in Massachusetts, so I guess it is a little bit more genuine than it otherwise would be as a coworker.
Yeah, definitely.
So I have a ton of stuff that I want to cover, and I think you're like one of the best people around who can speak to like this concept of a pitching lifespan, just because you deal with 12-year-olds all the way up to big leaguers and see a little bit of it on a daily basis. But I think it's probably important to maybe frame the discussion beforehand. So maybe speak a little bit to your path to getting to being the pitching coordinator at CSP Mass. What led you to this day?
Yeah, so I guess it would start with my playing career. I played 5 years of independent league baseball. Never really got the chance to take that jump into affiliated baseball, but that's kind of where my passion for like strength and conditioning and learning about pitching kind of developed. I came to CSP as an athlete to try to improve my own career, and just kind of fell in love with the process of training and learning everything that I could, to help myself and then to help the players that I was working with during the off seasons. As an independent league player, you don't make a ton of money, so you're always working through the off seasons. And I was training guys, both in the gym and on the mound, and I just kind of did everything I could to figure out how to get better and to take that for myself and for the guys I was working with.
Absolutely. I guess, the thing that I think is maybe an important part of this discussion is like you became a CSP mass strength and conditioning intern, before you went the pitching route. I mean, that was something that happened subsequently. Like, speak to me a little bit about like why you thought that was maybe an important step along the way, if it even wasn't like a planned, kind of step in the timeline. Where does that fit into what you do?
Yeah, I think it really gave me context of what good movement looks like. I wanted to learn more about what the body does, how it gets into efficient positions, how I can influence those positions on the mound and in the gym, just trying to figure out for myself, to take that step as a pitcher into like being a competent pitching coach. I think you have to have a better understanding of what the body does. And I think, the internship was a good avenue for me to figure that out and to learn from the guys that were there and just to take that into my
Yeah.
own, knowledge base.
I think we're going to build on that a lot. I think as this discussion continues, but I want to touch back on this pitching lifespan concept that I brought up earlier. You deal with a wide variety of age groups, experiences, all that stuff. But let's talk about the first meeting with a player. So, like, how does the coach / athlete relationship begin? If you're meeting with a 12 or a 13-year-old for the absolute first time.
Yeah, I think the initial meeting, with an athlete is going to have a lot of similarities, whether it's a young kid, a high schooler, or all the way up to, the big league level. But I think the goal to me is to start with building that initial relationship, getting to know the person in front of you as a person and not just a pitcher. So I'm always trying to establish some trust and just to show them that I care about their situation and I want to help them reach their goals and just be a tool for them to, help their playing career. And obviously the conversation changes depending on the level and the age of the person you're with. But I think the goal and the purpose of the conversation is still the same regardless. And I think that's where it starts. So, with the 13-year-old, a lot of times the parents are involved in that conversation. But I think we're going to start off discussing, the basic stuff, collecting information, like things like what school they go to, the teams they play for in the summer and fall, making those connections, finding out what other sports they play, what positions they play, if they're a reliever or a starter, just continuing to collect as much information as I can just to kind of paint the picture of who they are as a pitcher. And from there, we kind of just start talking about the throwing calendar, what they've been doing, where they've been playing, how much they've been throwing, what they're competing for next, like what are they preparing for? Are they throwing in a game, a workout, a practice? They have a showcase coming up. We'll discuss their inning counts in the summer, the spring, the fall, kind of talk about when they might want to shut down, take a break if they plan to, dive into things like injury history, where they get sore and they throw a lot, start the discussion on their training history, especially at this age at 13. They probably don't have a ton of training experience, try to kind of push them that way if I can. So I think there's a ton of benefit to getting started at that age. Talk about when they hit their last growth spurt, what their body's doing, what they look like. We'll talk about what their routine looks like in terms of what they think has worked for them, in terms of what makes them feel good, what they think makes them perform good, or perform well, I should say. At this age, they don't really know necessarily, but I think it's important for them to start considering these variables and start paying attention to these things that are going to impact their performance in the long run.
Yeah.
From there, after getting all that information, I think we finally can try to transition into like actually talk about pitching, right? Talk about their pitch mix, talk about what pitches they want to improve on, talk about developing a secondary pitch, mastering that pitch before taking that step to a third pitch. I think they skip that step sometimes at that age, especially they get caught up in wanting to throw, 6 different pitches instead of just throwing one other pitch that moves.
Yeah.
From there we can talk about other specific goals they have, besides throwing harder, because every kid that age is going to say that, but just building building the skill of goal setting and kind of understanding what that long-term and short-term goal process looks like. I think to sum it up, I think a lot of time at that age is just spent talking about building a routine and building habits and helping them establish their own so they know and understand what it takes to kind of improve that skill of training. I think some people don't really understand what it's like to work, especially at that age. I think that's one awesome thing about our gym dynamic is that these kids are there every day and they can see the college and pro guys training alongside them, and they can kind of just learn from observing them and kind of understand what it's like to work and train. And I think that's a great thing to learn at an early age for sure.
Are there points in that conversation that potentially are red flags for you? Like, I know for me at like that age, anytime I interact with them and I get into a situation where, I hear like pitcher only, baseball only, whenever I hear like a parent, doing all of the talking for the kid, like that always concerns me. Like, are there red flags that you have, in that regard, or, in the context of pitching?
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree. I try to talk to the kid in front of me instead of the parents as much as I
Yeah.
can. But they definitely try to take over the conversation sometimes. But no, I definitely agree. There's some red flags in terms of kids that are, 13 years old, already trying to focus on baseball, already talking to me about showcases and, just kind of skipping the steps of being a kid and being an athlete first and learning to move and just having some fun with the games that they're playing and kind of skipping those steps and trying to do too much too quickly, I think, for sure.
Absolutely. So that was the 13-year-old side. How does it change as we start to get a little bit older? So, we're talking middle school, or what about when we're talking about that, high school sophomore slash junior, the 16-year-old?
Yeah, I think the majority of the main conversation points still apply, but I think the conversation shifts more towards their role on their high school team or their summer team. Talking to the kids about what their role is and how they want to improve that role if they're not getting the innings or the meaningful innings that they want. At that age, we can start talking about college aspirations and what schools they might have their eyes on. We can have an honest discussion about what they think's holding them back from getting there. Is it velocity? Is it a secondary pitch? Is there a third pitch? At that age, there's some time to work on those things. So I think it's important to kind of put it in their mind at that age, like, hey, we have some time. Let's start working on those things. Let's develop a long-term and short-term plan to take you from where you are to where you want to be. Um, and I think at that age too, the throwing calendar becomes more and more important because these kids are going to showcases, they're going to practices year round. The total workload of throwing just starts to increase a little bit. And that's where we can help and kind of talk to them about what showcases they should be going to. When should they be going to them?
Mm-hmm.
How should they prepare for them? Is it the right time of year to be throwing at that intensity? um, you know, Having an honest discussion about, hey, are you developed enough to have something to showcase at this showcase, or should you save your money and kind of spend some time training? It's not always a fun discussion, but I think in the long run they appreciate the honesty. So I think that's important to tell someone up front if they're ready for that kind of thing. But again, the discussion on training in the gym and their experience starts to become even more important because you can actually start changing their body weight and their size and talk to them if they're in a good place to take them to where they want to go. If they do have those college aspirations, we got to start making some changes and start taking training and eating more seriously. I think that age it just becomes more and more important to have them start take ownership of their own routine. As a coach, I'm going to be a tool for them, but at that age, they really have to start to develop and kind of solidify their own routine if they're serious about the game. And they do have those college ball aspirations, which the large majority of our kids that come in do. They kind of have to start taking ownership of those things.
I think there are a couple of pearls right there. Like the first one is this concept of giving people really honest feedback at that age. And if you can ask an athlete and are you open to very direct feedback, and they'll always say yes because they think they are, but very rarely is that actually the case when we're talking about a 16-year-old that we both know like the challenge that you face, really anywhere is I think they fail to appreciate how many baseball players there are in the country. Just the sheer volume of kids that are vying for that Division I roster spot, that they covet and what it actually takes to compete at that level. I think we both had these kids that, we've seen the guys that come in and they're rising seniors who say, I want to go to Vanderbilt or I want to go to Virginia or whatever. And they're 17 years old and they throw 81 and it's just, not that we, have to sell out for this velocity dream all the time, but there is a harsh dose of reality that needs to be involved in some of those conversations. And I mean, I've watched you do it. You're one of the best at kind of massaging it, but at the same time, giving people very direct, honest feedback. Would you agree that a lot of people aren't ready for the harsh dose of that reality they say they think they can handle?
Yeah, totally. Like that's not something anybody wants to hear. And obviously you got to deliver it with a little bit of bedside manner. But at the end of the day, if I build somebody up and I tell them that they're ready to do all these things and then they go out and, it doesn't happen for them, they look at me and be like, hey man, you told me I was ready. So at the end of the day, I think it's just more important to be honest and upfront about those kind of things for sure.
Absolutely. So let's fast forward. We touched on college. What are we talking about in these initial meetings with a 19-year-old pitcher, where there's been some college coaching in place, and or they may be a gap year type kid trying to get to that point. Where do you start in those discussions?
Yeah, so the starting point again, like a lot of overlap in those initial points that I said, but at that age, I think the conversation shifts to where they're currently at. Like you said, there's some gap year guys at that age, or they might be at a 4-year or 2-year school, and again, are they in the role that they want? Do they see themselves getting more innings? Do they want more innings? Do they want to transition to a starting pitcher, relieving pitcher, whatever? I think it's important to have them self-evaluate and kind of tell me what they think's holding them back from getting that role or getting those more important innings and starting that discussion. With the same as the 16-year-olds thinking about college, some of these kids are thinking about pro ball, and if they do have professional aspirations, is that something that I think might be in the cards for them? Like again, is their height and weight in a good spot for those aspirations? Is their velocity where it needs to be getting those looks? Do they have at least one projectable off-speed pitch that can play at the next level? It's one thing to get out at college or a JUCO school or wherever they're at, but it takes something else to project and get professional hitters out. And then again, like we'll go into talking about things like the throwing calendar, which I think is often mismanaged in the college realm. With summer ball, fall workouts, and spring ball, we see a lot of quick, short, unnecessary breaks and quick ramp ups that could be avoided if guys would just keep throwing in some capacity and time up their breaks a little bit more intelligently. I think another topic that is unique to the private sector is that I get to talk to these kids too about like what they're doing with their college coaches and in their system, and if they like the style of the school and the coaching. Are they doing things or forced to do things that they don't necessarily agree with or like? Can I help them navigate those waters, trying to make sure they get what they need, in terms of development, but while also respecting their team and their coaches' needs. So I think there's a balance to that as well. I think college arms, it just comes down to being more upfront and having a discussion with them and us working together to get them from where they are to where they want to be. Whereas the younger guys, it's a little bit more of me telling them and pushing them and kind of pushing them in the right direction and kind of having to tell them what they need instead of like having a discussion with these older guys. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think college is challenging because for I don't want to say high school players are a very like homogenous pool, but you know generally speaking, you don't see a crazy amount of variability across like what kids are exposed to in high school. In the college realm, you might have kids at Division III programs that that don't have strength and conditioning coaches and may have very very limited access to a lot of the advanced technology and like that. And you may also see Division I kids who go to schools with multi-million-dollar biomechanics lab and TrackMan data in the stadium as well as Edgertronic cameras and all that stuff. So it's probably a wide variety. So that conversation, I have to assume for you, runs a lot longer on the front end because it can go in so many different directions.
Yeah, like you said, like there's guys that'll come in that have never thrown out a Rapsodo with TrackMan, never even really seen what those look like in some instances. And then we'll have guys that'll come in and hand me a report on day one as I'm meeting them and like, hey, this is what I look like. This is my stuff. So it's definitely a wide spectrum of different, situations that we do encounter.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, on maybe a far lesser degree, that happens in minor league baseball as well, or really across professional baseball. So, how do the conversations evolve when you talk to that 23-year-old who's in high A or something like that that's coming in for you? Has your experience been that there's a crazy amount of variation in terms of who you'll actually see from a professional ranks as well?
Yeah, I think with like the minor league level, we'll spend a little more time talking about specific goals and specific performance related things. And what it's going to take to get them to the next level from where they're at and help them advance their careers. I think the conversation kind of starts with where they currently fit in with the organization they're with. Were they a high draft pick? Were they a low level free agent sign that's kind of on the cusp of being released this year? If they don't come back with something new or something different or some kind of improvement, I think these guys have more specific goals for themselves, and there's things that we can talk about for them specifically, and some of these goals are even coming from their pitching coordinators or higher up in the organization, and specific things to work on that they come to us with. But again, I think it's the most important thing is just to really hone in on what they think is holding them back from taking the next step in their career. Because at the end of the day, that's what these guys are here for. That's what they care about, and that's what's going to, hopefully change their lives if we can get them to the big leagues. Um, so I think it's important to, kind of talk about some more subjective things on top of that, how they felt throughout the season. Some of these kids are throwing in a full pro season for the first time, and it's a lot different than college, and they get a lot more innings. And, they go from a big Division I school where they're treated like kings to minor league grind, and they're not used to that. They'll come back with, some very different body weight fluctuations, some of them gaining weight, some of them losing weight. Definitely sees both sides of that. From there, we kind of take the conversation into, how many innings they threw, start talking about the throwing calendar for them, when they want to start throwing, when they want to start bullpens this offseason, live at bats, that kind of stuff. Do they need a little more time off this year because they're feeling banged up at the end of the season, or do they need to start throwing earlier because they feel like they fall into that category that I mentioned before, where if they show up next spring training with nothing different or no improvement, then, they don't feel real safe in their spot on the team. So I think, with these guys, I spend more time discussing what works for them within their routine, since they have a much bigger sample size than the younger guys, the college guys, what they've done in their career, and they have much more context of what they like and what works for them. And, we kind of take that conversation and figure out if the routine's working for them, or, is it time to try something new? Should we get more aggressive with the training, less aggressive? Do you need more high intensity days on the throwing side? Do you need more days off or more low days if you're not recovering well? Those conversations I think can be really valuable for guys that have never actually thought about their entire throwing calendar and their throwing routine. And from there, I think we can kind of get into more specific things like their pitch metrics, their heat maps, their pitch usage percentage, their video breakdowns. Are there things we can clean up in their delivery for both health and performance related things? In terms of their pitches, are there any outlier characteristics that they should be using more? Do they show flashes of those outlier characteristics that maybe they need to develop more and spend more time on? Should we alter the pitch mix usage a little bit to play to their strengths? I think some of these younger guys still keep getting beat on their third and fourth best pitch, and they don't realize that they shouldn't even be throwing those half the time. So, I think things like that sometimes get overlooked. And then in terms of honest conversations, like we talked about before, I think with the minor league guys, sometimes it's important just to talk to them about their stuff in general. Is their stuff projectable in terms of getting success or having success and getting outs at the higher level, right? Obviously you can't predict that with certainty, but there's definitely some trends that you see. And, we've seen a handful of guys who have success at the lower levels, just pitching to their strengths and knowing how to use their stuff. But sometimes that stuff doesn't necessarily translate well to higher levels against better hitters. And, it's a tough conversation to have. But again, I think the honesty up front is important. There's a lot of hesitancy to change in those situations, and rightfully so if they're having success. But I think sometimes it's better to be a little bit more proactive instead of reactive. And, you can accelerate your career a little quicker that way if you kind of get ahead of that. Yeah.
I think people fail to understand the numbers game of professional baseball as well. I mean, certainly we talked about it with respect to high school players, but in a college setting, a pitching coach may deal with 15 to 17 pitchers, something along those lines. Not a crazy volume of athletes. In professional baseball, you're dealing with 10 times that. It's really that many guys. So you often have players, certainly in more organizations, in certain organizations more than others, that may come back and not understand the difference between the processes and the outcomes. They might not even understand the difference between ERA and FIP, or some of those things where they come back and maybe they're down on a year or they're really high on a year, and they don't necessarily understand if that true outcome was indicative of how they pitched and what that stuff might have actually done and at a higher level. So I do think those are really honest conversations. And maybe it leads to my next question: are those direct, honest conversations easier to have with the 30-year-old big league veteran? You worked closely with Savali last year as he remade a delivery and developed a new changeup. Like you've been throwing partners for Kluber and Oliver Drake and a lot of these higher level throwers. Does it work a little bit easier at that higher level, or do you feel like the challenges are different?
No, I think it's definitely easier in terms of they're just more self-aware. They have a little bit more feel. They've been around. I think a lot of the discussion points are pretty similar, but they definitely have more of an awareness of what their stuff is and where they're at in their career and what direction they're kind of heading. I think with those guys, it's always useful to kind of take a step back and look at their situation from a global point of view in terms of where they currently are and if
Mhm.
they're trending a certain way. Everybody ages, so it's important to
Yeah.
kind of open that discussion and kind of see where they're at, right? Like we could talk about when they had their best seasons in terms of results and in terms of how they felt subjectively. So they just have a lot of context in terms of like what might work for them, what doesn't work for them, both on the throwing and the training side. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think it becomes important to talk about, with those routines as they get older, like, were you successful because of what you were doing or in spite of it? Like, you can get away with a lot of things being more talented than anybody else around you, right? So I think it's important to open up those discussions to, maybe changing some of those routines that you did or those habits you had when you were younger. Maybe your body's not holding up as well as it was, 5 years down the line. And that's another conversation I think you always got to have with those older guys is, how's your body holding up? What weight are you currently at? What weight have you performed at your best at? Do you physically feel like you can perform at the level you did when you were at your best, or, is it time to pivot and maybe change your approach and be a little more proactive instead of reactive, like I said before? And, we've seen veterans stick around longer because they're able to maybe tweak some things or change what they do or reinvent themselves in some cases, altering their pitch mix or their usage or their stuff. And, I just think those are important things to try to get ahead of instead of wait for it to happen, instead of just waiting for your stuff to kind of fall off. Let's talk about what we can do to, continue to make changes and continue to push the envelope and continue to improve despite getting older and further along into your career.
Mhm.
Um, I think we can always compare videos from what you looked like at your best in
Yeah.
your best years and, compare that to the years that you didn't feel as good and the year that you struggled a little bit. And, compare that to your pitch metrics and your usage percentage from year to year and just, weigh that with their performance and the outcomes. And, the older and more experienced these guys get, the more the conversation I think becomes a discussion and the more listening I end up doing. These guys have plenty of stuff that I can learn from and take to these younger guys that I work with too. And, these guys have a pretty good idea of what they're doing and they have a lot of tools at their disposal at all times and plenty of people to help them. So at the end of the day, my goal is just to be another resource and tool for these guys to perform at their best and, just be someone they can trust and just know that I'm there to help in any way that I can.
Absolutely, man. So, to piggyback on maybe something I asked earlier, I talked about the progression from the strength and conditioning, internship into a pitching coach role where you actually still were coaching as a strength and conditioning coach on the side. One thing I've always really admired about you is that you always ask about how the physical assessment went before you dig in on a mechanical assessment. So, before you ever do a video or really even throw a pitch with guys, there's usually a quick conversation with the strength and conditioning coach for, 30 seconds. Hey, give me the nuts and bolts of how this guy moves. I'm curious why you do that. What are there certain specifics that you're looking for in those conversations that clue you into, maybe a faster path to learning about this athlete?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, first get an idea of the person in front of you and how they like to move. And, we all have this idea of in our mind of like what the body generally likes to do and how it likes to move and how it likes to operate. But at the end of the day, the person in front of you is always going to have some deviations from that model that you have in your head. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to get that information up front so you know what their body likes and the positions they like to be in and the positions they're biased towards and what positions might be more efficient for them on the mound. um, in terms of specifics, as a staff we're always looking at the baseline ranges of motion, upper body, lower body, basic movement qualities with some active movement screens, rib cage orientation, resting posture, pretty much all that information I like to know. Not that I necessarily do something with all of it, it's just information and it's building a picture in my head of what this person in front of me likes to do and how they like to move. um, as a pitching coach, I want to know what positions guys might struggle to get into and what positions their bodies like and, like I said, are more biased towards. And I also want to know, like, do they have any glaring limitations or red flags that I might have to work around and all that kind of stuff. So, and I think from there, like, once you have that information, you can kind of look at the videos and look at how they're moving on the mound and kind of see if it matches up with what you saw on the table or their movement screens. If someone's having success, the conversation's a little bit more nuanced in terms of the changes you go after. But either way, you want to know that if you're asking someone to make a change, they're physically capable of doing it before you ask them to do it. If someone's not having success, from there, the discussion becomes a little easier. And it's, how do we influence their movements or their delivery in a way that allows them to move a little more efficiently or more alignment, more in alignment maybe with what their anatomy or their body wants to do. And just understanding those limitations, I think can save a lot of time and effort on the back end. Um, I think as another point, those limitations can have an impact on from anything from performance to velocity, health, even pitch metrics. Something we've talked about too is, take for example, someone we see kind of commonly as a pitcher who might lack a little bit of internal rotation on their lead leg. So if that same picture them working across their body a little bit in terms of direction on the mound, if you see them have issues backspinning a fastball or getting to the front of a breaking ball, then it becomes a discussion of is it a grip issue? Is it a release issue? Or is it really just an issue of that lead leg is stopping them from being able to stay on the ball long enough to manipulate it out in front? So all those things I think are, really important in terms of deciding how you want to attack certain things. On the health side, if that same pitcher is having some consistent soreness or has an injury history that's consistent with someone that might have a deceleration pattern that's cut short, like in this case, because that lead leg we talked about, we can just start connecting the dots and, in a way we can start manipulating those things, and those things can become major influencers on the decisions that we're making together. So I think once we have that information, the discussion with them is like, okay, as a pitching coach, can I change that delivery, or do I need to, or is that something that on the performance side they might be able to gain a few degrees of range of motion with, right? Is it a bony block, or is it something that's there to stay? I'm pretty lucky that I get to work with the best performance coaches and therapists, and they can usually help guys get a little bit of range of motion, or they can help me decide that this is something that we're probably not going to change, in which case we have to work around it and change the delivery a little bit. And in this example that I gave, that's something we would have to work on, clearing the front hip and being a little bit more directional so that they have a chance to get through that front hip easier and not get cut off. So I just think there's so many things you can take from the assessment, and I never want to miss a chance to, gain some information about that person. And I guess another factor, that information that we get from the assessment, we can kind of use in terms of building their throwing program for them, and in terms of risk tolerance or how aggressive we want to get it. So if you have a guy that has some clear limitations, they're probably not a good candidate for a more aggressive throwing program. For example, we had a kid this summer who came off of shoulder surgery. He was a pretty tight shoulder capsule. Or another kid, you can take example like if someone lacks, like, for example, external rotation of their shoulder, that's not something we want to get super aggressive with. That's not something you want to gain really quickly. So those are some things that you can take from the assessment to kind of build into your throwing program, and kind of just use those variables to make decisions. And I think they go a long way.
I like that. So let's build on that. I talked a little bit about using that information prior to a video evaluation, but what are some of the things that are the foremost critical instance that you're looking at in the delivery when you do in a video evaluation? Probably independent of age and ability level. Like, a good delivery is a good delivery. So what do you look for when you slow things down and do a video breakdown with a kid and his parent, or an athlete at the high school or college level?
Yeah, I think before even getting into the finer details and slowing things down, I think it's important to kind of look at the delivery from a more global perspective. Stuff you can see from the dugout or across the room, without slow motion. So looking at the big picture stuff like direction and tempo and athletic feel of the delivery, is it really stiff and rigid, or is it pretty smooth and athletic? How they're using the ground. So I think all these big global things are going to directly impact some of the finer details that we'll look at. And when it comes to these smaller finer details or positions or checkpoints or whatever you want to call them, I think it's important just to say that there's no such thing as a perfect delivery. I think efficiency is going to look a little bit different for everybody. So as we go through some of the checkpoints, I think it's easy to get caught up in those positions themselves, but I think in reality, it's more important to look at how they're moving in and out of those positions and how they got there. So that being said, I think the first thing that I'm looking at is their setup and their first move or leg lift. Setup to me isn't really all that important unless it gets in the way of something. So if there's something in the delivery that we deem as inefficient or kind of getting in their way, if the setup is kind of feeding into that, then we might, make look some small modifications there. But Other than that, I think the first move, I think it's important to maintain proximal stability and kind of stay stacked and stay neutral with that upper body through the leg lift. And then on top of that, I think it's important to get the center of mass moving towards the plate. And I think it's, those main points right there. I think it's, if you lose position early in the delivery, it's going to influence everything else that you see later in the sequence. So I think it's just important to establish, a good position from the get-go. But outside of that, I think the first main important thing to look at is how they're getting into that back hip and how they're getting into that back leg. We need the back leg to provide stability and provide direction to set up the rest of the sequence. We need the back hip to load efficiently by creating tension and loading in all three planes. Some amount of flexion, internal rotation, adduction. It's going to look a little different for everyone depending on their anatomy and their range of motion. And that's where the assessment ties in. I think it's important to match their loading strategy and kind of see how it lines up in terms of their range of motion that they have. Is the depth and the position that you see what you would expect considering their strength levels, their maturity level, how elastic they are, in terms of depth, all those variables kind of come into play. So after the back leg and the back hip, I'm looking at, what the glove side's doing and how the trunk is staying stacked. That proximal stability, I think, is super important. And when I say that, I'm talking about the relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis, just maintaining a neutral position there. And then we're looking, there's going to be an extension moment, obviously. So we're looking to see when that moment happens and if it's timed properly. But with the glove side, I think when we look at the glove side, I think it can be overcoached, but in reality, I think the main points are just to use the glove side to help you load your trunk and help you unload your trunk. And that's going to look a little different for everybody. But on top of that, the glove side, I think we need to look at it in terms of assisting in proximal stability. We know that holding internal rotation and pronation of the glove side can influence the position of the rib cage. So helping keep this trunk stacked and in a neutral and loaded position, the glove side can assist in that as well.
I feel like we need to do a full podcast just on glove side, because that's been something that's a big discussion point about the facility over the years. So I don't know, maybe it's better for a webinar so you can show it, but important stuff for sure.
Yeah, we might have to. But just as a side note, I wanted to say too, like, it's not required for guys to hold that pronation, internal rotation. You'll see plenty of guys that don't. But I think for guys who struggle with, maybe leaking open early with that rotation or losing proximal stability, I think it can be a good tool for them to use. So after that, looking at the arm action next, I do believe the arm is heavily influenced by what the rest of the body is doing. And I think a large percentage of arm action issues can be typically cleaned up by cleaning up the lower half and what the trunk are doing. But there are instances where guys, they might have been coached into a bad habit, or they see something online and try it, or they try to get real short or long, or, they'll do some weird stuff. Or guys coming off injuries too. You'll see guys that are sore or in pain or guarded. They can fall into some bad habits that, influence the arm action separate from, what the lower half is doing as well. So there is definitely a time and place to focus on the arm action. But, with the arm action, I'm looking at where is the arm at front foot strike. When that front foot gets in the ground and starts to accept force into the ground, I want to see that the arm's in a good position to start transitioning into external rotation, start to lay back, and begin that acceleration process. But like I mentioned before, I think it's usually more important to kind of dive into how the arm got there. So like what it did at handbrake, how they lifted the arm, how it got up into that position, how it's transitioning into that timing into layback. I want to see how it's unwinding through the throw. Is it real pushy? Is it very linear in nature? Is the proximal rotation of the trunk pulling the arm into extension and internal rotation pronation, or is it, kind of being manufactured through the arm only? Is the deceleration pattern looking clean? Are they giving the arm enough time to slow down, and how much time does it have to slow down? Like I said before, I think there's a lot of things that are impacting the arm action through the rest of the body. So just because you see something that maybe be inefficient with the arm, it doesn't mean you're going to attack it by changing the arm. More times than not, we're going to look at the rest of the body and look to change, what the back hip's doing, what the trunk's doing to affect the arm action as a result. So after the arm action, I'm looking at the position at front foot strike as a whole and what the front hip's doing. When they get in that position, like I said before, is the arm ready to go in a good spot? And again, how do they get in that position? I think that's, much more important than just the position itself. But, I think if they're in a good position by this time, you can get away with a lot of stuff earlier in the delivery that might not look as good or be as efficient or be as aesthetically pleasing. So if you get to a good spot here, you can kind of get away with some stuff. But at this position, we're looking to see if the hips are starting to open, is the torso still closed and loaded? Does the impulse of the front leg kind of accelerate the pelvis and do, faster rotation, more angular velocity? Is what I mean by that is is the impulse speeding up the hip rotation, and is the front hip pulling backwards? I prefer to view it more as like a pullback rather than a linear block. So I want to see that the front hip is pulling backwards to actually kind of facilitate that trunk driving over it and delivering the trunk over that front hip rather than just kind of leaking into the ground and falling forward and not doing a whole lot.
I like that.
Yeah, I'd say those are the main points.
And that's the gold. And honestly, I think there are a lot of pitching coaches that I hope would go through and actually re-listen to that and make it a list, because this concept of proximal to distal, early to late, is vitally important. But I think it also lends itself to you have some of the most innovative drills that I've seen in my career, and I don't mean that in a hey, let's make up some random stuff to throw on Instagram for entertainment purposes. I very rarely see a lot of them elsewhere. So I'm curious. You're obviously a creative guy in this regard. Talk to me about what makes for a good drill in your eyes. What are the key principles that guide your desire to innovate on this front, and you determining whether something is a good drill or not?
So I think our understanding of skill acquisition as an industry has gotten a lot better. It's kind of a hot topic, and I've learned a ton from a lot of really smart people out there. But when it comes to a good drill, I think the number one thing to remember and to look at is the drill or the environment that you set up for this person. Is it actually changing the movement that you're trying to change? If the answer is yes, then great. Then they're moving a little bit differently now. Can they actually feel that difference now? Can they separate this new movement or this new feeling from their old pattern, or is there not enough context yet? And, do you have to spend a little bit more time there? And with regards to that, I usually like to give, visual feedback on top of what they're feeling, just so they can kind of get it from two sides. But, if they can feel that difference, can that feeling be taken into catch play with a baseball in their hand? At the end of the day, that's what matters to me the most, because that's where they're going to have to transfer what they're doing into their performance, with the baseball in their hand. So I think it's important to kind of discuss with them and make sure they understand what we're trying to work on, and kind of make sure they fully understand the concept. So I think it creates buy-in for one. I think it helps with the fact that there's rarely immediate success or instant gratification in these changes or in these instances. I think a lot of times you get a little worse before you get a little bit better, depending on what you're changing. So understanding these things up front, I think, can help with the process and can help with the mental battle a little bit too. But when deciding what direction to go with a drill specifically, I'm usually asking myself questions like, should I speed it up? Should I slow it down? Should I change the environment? Manipulate how they're starting or what they're doing, change the goal, change the task. Should I make it more constrained, less constrained? Should I challenge the movement? Should I assist the movement? Should I feed into what they struggle with so they have to work to overcome that change, or do they need some assistance at first to feel how to overcome it, and how it feels to start to make that change? So there's so many variables that you can manipulate to help them kind of make a movement change. But on top of that, I'm usually asking myself what kind of athlete I'm dealing with. How do they like to learn, or how do they respond to certain things? Most guys in this regard seem to be a combination of visual and kinesthetic learners. So showing them what you want to do, and then also getting them to feel something that kind of helps accelerate the process, rather than just telling them or explaining them. Hearing it's not the same thing as feeling it or seeing it. Another thing I really like is the idea of a feed forward athlete versus a feedback. It's a concept I picked up from our performance director, John O'Neill. So the best way I can explain it is it's like a spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum, you have a very stiff and rigid mover that's really good at creating tension and really great in kind of one set pattern. So picture the guy that's really good at bracing and creating a ton of pre-tension and picking up, 500 pounds off the floor with a deadlift with ease. But then you take that same guy and you ask him to make a throw on the run or do something outside of his normal delivery, and he kind of stumbles and trips over his own feet. So these kind of guys, I think, benefit from changing the stimulus pretty frequently, changing the environment, the goal, the task, changing the implement they're throwing, different balls. getting them moving in different ways, throwing on the run, just doing things differently where they have to organize themselves and kind of respond to their environment instead of like just always being in a predictable pattern, because they're good when they can predict the pattern and kind of predetermine what they have to do, but they don't do well when they have to respond. And on the other end of the spectrum, I would say the opposite of those guys would be guys you have to slow things down for, find ways to create tension for them, change the environment or task, force them to preset certain positions, create tension, and kind of show them what it feels like to find those positions and create that tension. And from there you can kind of challenge that pattern a little bit. But, at the end of the day, I think while you experiment with these different things, these different feels, these movements, I think it's important to keep in mind the main principles of the delivery that we talked about before and not get too far removed from them or from the actual sport and the movement patterns of throwing. And just respecting these key movement competencies and the principles that you're using, and just finding ways to challenge them and not being afraid to get creative, in order to change the way someone moves or create awareness for them. And just not being married to certain drills. If something isn't clicking for someone, I don't think there's any point in wasting time and just making them internalize something further and just becoming more rigid and robotic. And I've seen it spiral out of control when they're trying so hard to get a certain thing you're asking them to do, and it's just getting worse and worse. Why not do something different and create that movement or create that feeling or that movement you're after, and then just bring it back to something that more closely resembles the skill of throwing. So there's better carryover. As long as you keep bringing it back to the skill, I think it's definitely appropriate to get creative as long as you bring it back and you see it transfer to their catch play with the baseball in hand. That's the end goal to me.
I love the point about taking guys and making them uncomfortable in that world, because I do think, and I'm sure you'd agree, we are in a little bit of an era of, we see a lot of pitchers who are built in labs, right? And they sell out for the dream, and the second an outing ends, even if they get absolutely tattooed, they ask what the velo was, what the spin was. They talk about a lot of that, but they struggle to hold runners. They struggle when the game speeds up with them. They struggle to hold, field their position. And I'm not saying we need to send guys out and do 7 hours of PFP, but I do think there's something to be said about finding creative ways to train adjustability in throwers. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, something people need more of. And I think it can be a challenging thing to find and set up within the constraints of, throwing in a 1-lane cage and finding ways to create adjustability. But I definitely think that's something that gets overlooked. And you see those kids in the game that don't have that. It's very apparent and very easy to see the kids that, can't adjust on the fly and can't make those changes within the game. And it's just very obvious.
Right on. All right. So moving forward, we're talking about developing young pitchers, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's do some quick hitters. What are the biggest mistakes that you're seeing in the players that are coming to you?
The first thing I would say is just trying to move on to more advanced things before mastering some of the basic things that we like. There's a lot of basic things that we know translate well to success. And I think, younger pitchers want to move on from those too quickly because they see all the cooler stuff that the older guys are doing and, the more fun things to work on in a sense. But, I think you got to master the basics before you move on to something else. If you can't throw a glove side fastball, why are you working on manipulating a breaking ball? Just trying to get those things kind of out of the way and establish that you have some competency on the basic stuff before trying to get too fancy with things. Another big mistake I see is just these kids not having an actual plan, both in terms of like the throwing calendar and like an individual session as well. So like with the throwing calendar, like looking at the season and as a whole and the year as a whole and planning out your breaks ahead of time, planning out when you're going to ramp up, planning out when you're going to build a work capacity. So you're not rushing to get ready, following a high-low model to make sure that you're building capacity and actually dosing the arm with stress at appropriate times. But, like I said, also having a plan for each throwing session, knowing how to warm up their body, not crushing a ridiculous volume of band workout before you throw just to fatigue your arm, throwing and warming up in a way that allows you to work on something and using a couple of lead up drills to just work on one flaw and, picking one thing at a time to work on instead of trying to work on 5 things at once. And I just don't think younger guys understand that, focusing on the little details can make a big difference. Something as simple as catch play, you see it a big difference from the young guys to the high school, to the college guys, to the minor leaguers, to the big leaguers. At each level, the catch play becomes much, much more serious and it's much more focused. And, it's easy to see those guys focusing at the higher levels compared to the lower levels. And I don't think the younger guys understand enough that they're just wasting reps and wasting time. And it's a big piece of development that I think they're missing. They just don't quite understand yet.
You may have just answered my next question, but I was going to ask, we're talking about young or high school pitchers, what are some easy ways for them to get quick competitive advantages over their peers? And I mean, when I wrote that up, I was thinking catch play myself, but it sounds like you answered it. But are there other things that you think, obviously sleep, nutrition, hydration, things along those lines? But where do guys miss out on easy opportunities to be successful above and beyond their peers?
Yeah, there's so many ways to go with that. Like you said, all the sleep, nutrition, hydration, all those things are pretty easy things to control, that they miss out on. But on top of that, I would just say, like, having a plan, like what I said before, I think is a easy thing that a lot of people miss. Just a plan heading into each throwing session, a plan for the calendar year, establishing a quality routine. And I think on top of that, I think guys don't stick to that routine long enough. I think too many guys jump from one thing to the next and don't get anywhere because the process takes time and they just move on before they see any results. But just focusing on the little things, like I said, with catch play, taking those things more seriously, taking the warm up seriously to make sure their arms ready to go and their body's ready to go and produce force and produce outputs at that level. And I think with the young guys, I think an easy thing is just picking one thing to focus on. I think they try to do too many things at once. They get caught up on working on 5 different things. And I think I mentioned it before too, but I think working on one pitch at a time is a step that most people skip. They want to work on a changeup and a curveball and a two seam all at the same time instead of just picking one and having one good secondary pitch and then moving on to a third by the time you get comfortable with that second. And I think a big step that a lot of young guys skip is just mastering basic foundational movement competencies in terms of like knowing how to lunge, knowing how to squat, knowing how to posteriorly shift their weight in the hinge, and just getting good at those, foundational concepts and not trying to get too far ahead of that and just letting development come a little bit to them instead of, trying to sell out for that, that cool looking thing that you see right away.
All right. All right, so we're going to the lightning round. I know you've listened to the podcast, so you've heard some lightning rounds, but I'm not going to go with my same boring questions. All right, so best book for up-and-coming pitching coaches to read, or up-and-coming pitchers, if you want to do that. You call it.
I'll go with pitching coaches, and okay. I'm going to say How to Win Friends and Influence People. Kind of sounds cliche, but to me, like communication and building trust and buy-in is everything. I don't think it matters what you have to say if the person in front of you doesn't want to hear it from you. So, building that relationship and trust is important.
Good deal. Hardest pitch to teach?
Hardest pitch. I'm not sure if I have a specific pitch, but the first thing that came to mind is the process of throwing a breaking ball. To me, it seems to take guys a lot longer to get comfortable throwing with a more supinated wrist. If they didn't spin breaking balls at a young age or if they didn't throw the football much, that's definitely something I see pretty consistently. It's just not comfortable for guys if they didn't do it a lot when they're younger.
I like that. Which MLB pitchers do you enjoy watching the most?
All of them. And that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think there's a lot of different ways to be efficient. And, the more you watch, the more context you have on what efficient movement looks like and what it can be.
Absolutely.
The more guys I watch, I think the more my own ideas are challenged in terms of like what good and bad looks like. But that just to pick a couple, like Scherzer, Verlander, Kluber, Cole, DeGrom, Greinke, these guys that have been around for a while and doing it at a high level for a long time, I think there's something to be, learned from them for sure.
And would you encourage young pitchers to look at those guys as well? Or are there certain models? Like I remember, when Matt Blake was our pitching, coordinator up there, like Matt would pull up videos of, like late 20s Zach Greinke as a Royal, just as like, hey, this is a dude who's, 185, 190 pounds, super durable, throwing in the mid 90s, throws a bunch of different pitches for strikes. And the delivery was one that you could break down and you could see a lot of important concepts there. Like, is there a guy that you feel like the most with a lot of your video assessments, or just encouraging young pitchers to go check this guy out?
Yeah, I mean, the names I mentioned, I usually pull up a variety of them. I usually pull up a Scherzer for a guy that might throw from a slightly lower slot. I'll pull up Cole and DeGrom a lot, and Kluber because he's one of our guys, and the kids that are around, they want to see him on the video, so they like it. But yeah, definitely, I would say definitely start with guys that are a little more simple and just kind of pick and choose what you can take out of their delivery rather than trying to emulate somebody that has a real complex and unique delivery.
I like it. And then the last one, this is a little bit of a broad question, but if you could map out an ideal yearly developmental calendar for a high school pitcher, how would you structure it?
So assuming the spring season is like March to the end of May,
Yep.
From there, I would say keep throwing until summer ball starts, whenever that is. Don't shut down. Summer ball being June to August, so you finish up around then. And assuming there's no fall ball, I would say, that's the time of year. If you're going to take a break, that's kind of that range that you'd want to, somewhere in the 4 to 12 week range, somewhere in that September, October, November months, depending on, how many innings they threw and how they feel, injury history, all that kind of stuff comes into play. But from there, I would say you start building up with catch play, take it slow, start November, December, start building into bullpens, January, February, depending on when the start of your season actually is. Mix in a couple live at bats before then, even if it's just in the cage before the first scrimmage or game, because, the adrenaline of the game environment can't be simulated in bullpens very well. And from there, you're ready to go. You start the season over again.
Nice.
I guess one more side piece that if you have like showcases and stuff in the fall or winter, don't shut it down completely. Just keep playing catch and kind of build into those, high stress environments. Give yourself plenty of time to build into those, and just don't overlook that process and don't go too quickly in those.
I like it. And, the other thing that maybe, I know we've talked about that's vital is, like, if you have the opportunity to play another sport, you know what I mean? I love that fall spring split where if you're going to take some time off, from throwing, it's perfect time to go play soccer or football or something in the fall where, it kind of ties up September 1 through, Thanksgiving or whatever it is. So good chance to get some, multifaceted development in there on top of, your strength training and all that.
Yeah, awesome. Definitely. I don't think there's a substitute for like being exposed to that many different movements in another sport. You're never going to make that many cuts in a baseball game compared to a soccer or basketball game. So definitely take advantage of those kind of things.
Absolutely. Well, that was good stuff, man. Jordan, you are on Instagram. It's at CSP Pitching. And then on Twitter, you are _Jordan Kraus, Kraus _. One of those Twitter handles that's impossible to locate, but we'll make sure we share it in the show notes and everything. Hey, really appreciate you coming on, man. This was some really good stuff, and I know I've learned a ton from working with you, and I'm sure our listeners will pick up some great tidbits from this as well.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.